Starting to record. Wait. Okay. So, dear friends, hello everyone. My name is Daniela Ozacky Stern, and I am proud to be part of the team of the Holocaust Studies program at the Western Galilee College in Akko, Israel. We are delighted to welcome you yet again to another fascinating virtual event in our Zoom series, which started about 2 years ago when the COVID had become part of our lives. During these 2 years, we have managed to create a devoted community of scholars and of students from around the world who are involved and interested in Holocaust and genocide studies. 2 of those young scholars are the initiators of today's event, Jan Burzlaff and Adi Kantor, whom we will meet in a few moments. Also with us today, Dr. Boaz Cohen, head of the Holocaust Studies program, and Yaron Pasher from our team. The current event presents some new research works dealing with the Holocaust in Western European countries like France, the Netherlands, Belgium, and others. The 3 following presentations will share new perspectives on persecution in these countries. As always, I have some technical notes. We are recording this session and we will upload it to our website. And please, if you can, keep your microphones on mute. If you have any questions for our panelists, please write them down on the chat and later on we will have a discussion. And now it is my honor to introduce Dr. Geraldien von Frijtag Drabbe Künzel, who will moderate the discussion. Geraldien received her doctorate in history from the University of Amsterdam. She has been a researcher at the NIOD Institute for War, Holocaust, and Genocide Studies in the Netherlands, and currently holds the position of Assistant Professor of History at the Utrecht University. She wrote on the Holocaust in the occupied Netherlands and more specifically, the application on racial laws and regulations in that country. And she examined the Dutch participation in the Germanization project in the occupied East. More recently, she began to engage with microhistorical research of the Holocaust. And she is right now in the middle of starting a new research dealing with the Holocaust in the Netherlands outside the big cities. Geraldien, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all? Because my microphone is sometimes a little bit erratic. Thank you very much for this invitation to moderate. I will be not talking about my own research. If there are questions, I would love to elaborate, but I would like to just say a few words about how happy I am with this topic this evening, because I think that for the last decades, the Holocaust scholarship has, in a way, tipped over to Eastern Europe. And this is, of course, completely understandable, because since the collapse of the communist rule and the gained access to primary sources in Eastern Europe, the research of the Holocaust in this part of Europe is clearly catching up or still catching up. And also because of Eastern Europe was the epicenter of the Jewish life in Europe and of Jewish death during the World War II. But in the light of all these new and exciting studies coming from that part of Europe, it is tempting to think that all has been and still is very quiet on the Western front, to just misquote the remark. This would mean that we overlook some little and important gems in Western European Holocaust scholarship. And I think that the speakers of tonight are the authors of 3 of these little gems. They present new, nuanced ways to study the Holocaust. And I think most importantly, they complicate a pretty persistent perception in Western Europe of the Holocaust as the story of Nazis and Jews. And the 3 speakers play with scale and space, concentrating on a person, a family, a city. But most of all, they highlight that the Holocaust in Eastern and Western Europe was as much a story of Nazi policy from above as a story engaging entire populations, societies, and communities. The first speaker of tonight is Professor Dr. Shannon Fogg. Professor Fogg currently serves as the Interim Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in the College of Arts, Sciences and Business at Missouri University of Science and Technology in the USA. She is also a professor of history in the Department of History and Political Science, and her research focuses on the history of daily life in France during and after the Second World War. She has been particularly interested in the interaction between material concerns and the exclusion of Jews in both rural and urban settings. The most recent projects have focused on the geography of the Holocaust in Paris, notably the material and human impacts of the Jewish persecution. Oxford University Press has published in 2017, I think, her Stealing Home on Jewish efforts in Paris to reclaim their apartments and other goods after the Holocaust. Her talk today is entitled Rethinking Place and Persecution in Wartime Paris. Shannon, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Geraldine. And I want to warmly thank everyone for putting together this panel and participating today, especially Daniela and Geraldine, Jan and Bob, Adi and Boaz. And it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here today and talk a little bit more about my ongoing research on the Shoah in Paris. And I do have a PowerPoint that I will share. Okay, let me move myself out of the way. Okay, all right, so today I am going to focus on the geography of the Holocaust in Paris to examine a series of interrelated questions. How did the physical and social exclusion of Jews proceed in a major urban area in Western Europe? What was the role of housing in facilitating the Holocaust in Paris? Did decisions related to the physical spaces of the capital help contribute to the survival of more than 75% of the Jews living in France? While these questions are anchored in a particular time and place, the broader themes they engage with, including refugees, housing, anti-Semitism, individual actions, and war, have implications that go far beyond Paris in the 1940s. I am particularly interested in ordinary urban spaces and persecution, an area of research that remains understudied in Western Europe. Studies of other cities in Central or Eastern Europe during the Holocaust that engage with geography tend to focus on ghettos and ghettoization, neither of which are directly relevant in the continental French context. With few exceptions, the questions of geographical place and social space have not been the object of scholarly research. Approaching the Shoah in Paris from the perspectives of and with sources related to social history, urban history, and geography reveals the depth and breadth of persecution in the city that was often centered on physical spaces. And today I'll focus on one particular aspect of urban geography, and that's housing. Housing is usually considered a private protective space, but it became a political tool that could construct and underline differences that contributed to marginalization and genocide. Housing concerns were central in facilitating the Holocaust and often implicated individuals in the exclusion of Jews for economic, material, ideological, and geographic reasons. Though never visibly demarcated as Jewish in Paris, housing was important in identifying, restricting, and excluding Jews from the French national community. Examining housing forces us to move beyond official German and Vichy legislation and to focus on the Holocaust as a socially embedded event anchored in physical spaces. Furthermore, scholarship on the Holocaust in France rightfully focuses on 1942 as a major turning point in anti-Jewish actions, highlighting the devastating mass arrests and deportations that year. Many also view 1942 as marking a shift in public opinion in favor of the Jews following these arrests. Approaching persecution from the perspective of housing, however, demonstrates the evolving nature of social exclusion that continued and even intensified in 1943 and 1944. While there was little in terms of new official anti-Jewish legislation after 1942 in France, some individuals were more active in excluding others based often on housing. This then shows the shifting chronology and geography of the Holocaust, from mass arrests to individual incidents on local levels. These local relationships and concerns were central in formulating housing policies and demonstrate the complex and sometimes deadly social dynamics at work in Paris during the Second World War. I'll start by giving some background on the residential living patterns of Jews in Paris, which was the largest city in Europe under German occupation during the war. A closer examination of a single Parisian arrondissement and an individual apartment building reveals that changing the physical and temporal scale of analysis further complicates generalizations often made about the Holocaust in France. Paris was a city with approximately 3 million residents in 1940, and it was home to the largest Jewish community in occupied Western Europe.
Shannon,
Yes.
I'm sorry, we still see the first slide.
Yep,
It's okay?
and I haven't moved it yet.
I'm so sorry, I'm sorry.
That's
Go
okay,
ahead.
thank you for telling me though. Yeah. All right, so approximately 2/3 of France's 300,000 Jews lived in the capital at the start of the war, and they made up a very diverse social, economic, cultural, and political community. Nearly half of the Jews in the capital did not have French, there it goes, okay. Did not have French citizenship, and many were recent refugees fleeing persecution. A census that was conducted in October of 1940 recorded over 100,000 Jews living in Paris's 20 arrondissements, almost evenly divided between French and foreign. A closer look at the numbers reveals that certain areas of the city had larger populations of Jews, especially the 3rd, the 11th, the 18th, and the 20th arrondissement. These neighborhoods were traditionally associated with the Jewish community and also tended to be working class with higher numbers of foreign Jewish residents. Mapping the declared residences of Jews from this October 20 census visually demonstrates the widespread living patterns of Jews in the city. While the eastern right bank was home to more Jews, in no area of the city were Jewish residents predominant. Estimates suggest that for Paris as a whole, approximately 5 to 7% of the population was Jewish. Despite anti-Semitic propaganda that talked about the Jewish ghetto, Paris was characterized by demographically and socially mixed neighborhoods, and Jews did not make up the majority of the population in any of them. Jews living in Paris did not experience ghettoization in either a specific portion of the city or in officially identified houses, but physical space was still part of the persecution process. This becomes clearer if we change our scale of analysis and focus more specifically on housing. In Paris, most residents did not own their apartments, and rented homes fell outside the official realm of economic Aryanization that systematically transferred Jewish-owned property and businesses to non-Jews. But the furnished apartments that had been so-called abandoned by their residents became an object of interest. Those apartments could be emptied of their contents and then released to new tenants once they were empty. And this solved different problems, including the need of bombing victims and settlers in Germany and Eastern Europe for furniture, and the need of French people for better accommodations. In Paris, the German-led furniture operation began in the spring of 1942 and led to the organized looting of more than 38,000 so-called abandoned apartments in the capital. Some of these homes had been left empty when their residents fled south ahead of the Nazi advance. Others were abandoned later in the occupation as Jews continued to flee persecution or went into hiding. A greater number were left empty after the first major roundups and deportations began in 1942. Once looted, these apartments could be rented to new residents. We've already seen a map created from the census of October 1940 with the declared residences of Jews in Paris. We can map deportation in Paris by the official addresses of deportees, although home was not necessarily the site of the arrest. This is just their official address that they provided. Nearly half of the Jews deported from France, more than 35,000, were Parisian residents. In most cases, the percentage of Jews living in each arrondissement as recorded in the October 1940 census and the percentage of Jews deported from that arrondissement are fairly close. But if we look a little more closely, we see noticeable differences occur in the 11th and 20th arrondissement in Eastern Paris, where higher percentages of Jews were arrested and deported. And then in the 16th and 17th arrondissement, where fewer Jews were arrested proportionally as compared to their census declarations. In the 11th and the 20th, those were poorer areas, working class, and seen as foreign, while the Western arrondissement were more affluent and had more French residents. These differences might suggest socioeconomic status and citizenship as factors in persecution and survival, including the ability to leave the capital or the importance of social networks with non-Jews. The census data and the deportation maps tell one story in Paris, but if we add other layers, such as the expropriation of apartments that formerly were homes to Jews, the reach of anti-Semitic activity through housing is even wider. In the immediate post-war period, looting victims had the opportunity to file a claim for restitution, and that's something I've explored somewhere else, so I won't talk about it today. But while incomplete, these dossiers provide one insight into the extent of the furniture operation in Paris. The discrepancies between reported looting, declared Jewish residences, and deportation addresses were pronounced in some arrondissements. And so I'll start with a map of Paris, and then these are the Eastern arrondissements that are most usually associated with Jewish community life in Paris. In those neighborhoods made up 74% of the deportees, but they only filed 58% of restitution claims after the war. In the West, where individuals were about 5.5% of deported Jews, they filed more than 15% of the restitution claims. So we do have this discrepancy in Paris. So to further examine these discrepancies, I have focused on the 17th arrondissement, located in the northwestern portion of the city. It's not really known as the center of Jewish life in Paris, but about 5% of Parisian Jews lived in the 17th arrondissement, over 70% of whom were French. There were close to 200 small businesses in the area that were required to identify themselves as Jewish-owned during the war, and the majority of those businesses were in the clothing industry. Based on the overall numbers, we might assume that due to the socioeconomic and citizenship status of the 17th Jewish residents, that there would be lower deportation numbers. And in this case, that is true. So it was about 5.2% of the Jewish population of Paris and 2.7% of the deportees. But when we examine the number of restitution claims for looted homes, the Jews of this arrondissement are overrepresented with approximately 7% of the post-war claims for looted personal property coming from this area. And this is a map where I've mapped all of the addresses of someone who filed a claim for their apartment being looted. And since the furniture operation was meant to affect only abandoned apartments, it might be easy to assume that a large proportion of claims for restitution would come from a home with a deported Jewish family member. However, there is very little overlap between deportation and looting addresses. Additionally, we can cross-reference the looted apartments with empty apartments that were reallocated to new residents during the war and see the even wider reach of anti-Jewish measures. Combining these records suggests that a significant number of apartments belonging to non-deported French Jews were also affected by various anti-Jewish measures. And this counters findings that focus solely on deportation statistics and that often highlight French survival rates. Once an abandoned apartment had been emptied of its furnishings, it could be released to new tenants, which was important as housing shortages increased with more frequent Allied bombings of Paris and its suburbs during the war. With the systematic arrest and deportation of entire families that began in the spring and summer of 1942, and the launch of the furniture operation also in 1942, there was now a more efficient means of locating and emptying apartments. French officials also played a role in this process, and they would be the first to suggest to the Germans that empty Jewish apartments be used to rehouse families that had been made homeless by urban renewal projects, bombings, or German requisitions. So not the Germans demanding it, but the French suggesting it first. By the spring of 1943, the Seine Prefecture had created a new section for vacant housing and relocation within its already existing housing service. This section approved requests to move new tenants into apartments that had formerly housed Jews. Approximately 25,000 apartments were released through this new section of the housing service in 1943 and 1944, and about 300 of those apartments were in the 17th arrondissement. So if I map all of those and closely examine the addresses associated with deportation, with restitution claims and reallocated apartments, we find some interesting trends in the 17th, especially if we adjust our scale to the level of the 4 administrative quarters. While deportation seems to have affected people rather evenly across the entire space of the arrondissement, and then on the left, those are the 4 different quarters in the 17th, moving from west to east, and it also moves from most affluent to less affluent across the geography. And we see that the deportation numbers are basically even between the 2 halves of the arrondissement. This changes if we look at the restitution numbers. And with more than 70% of the restitution claims coming from the Western, more bourgeois and more affluent part of the arrondissement. And the same is true for the reallocation of apartments in this arrondissement as well. So this suggests that the more luxurious apartments that were located closer to the German administrative headquarters in the adjacent 16th arrondissement were more desirable. It also suggests that the former residents had greater opportunities for escaping deportation by leaving their homes in choosing where they established new residences. And as I mentioned earlier, there's very little overlap between the looted apartments, the apartments that were homes to someone who was deported, and the released apartments. So if I put them all together, there were 337 restitution claims, but only 30 of them came from an address with a deportee, and 56 from an address of an apartment that was released to someone else. So I think the important thing is that 75% of those restitution claims of abandoned apartments came from an apartment that did not belong to someone who was deported or whose apartment was released to someone else. So this then demonstrates the breadth of persecution. And if I add them all up, there are at least 1,200 different apartments in the 17th arrondissement that have some kind of connection to anti-Jewish measures. And I should note that I haven't had the chance to include requisitioned apartments in this analysis, so that would add even more apartments as well. So this suggests that the majority of the abandoned apartments in the 17th belong to individuals that perhaps fled Paris or hid somewhere else in the city, things that required the everyday support of others, which opens another avenue of exploration. It is often claimed that Vichy saved French Jews, and overall survival percentages can support this claim. 90% of Jews with French citizenship survived the war, while only 60% of foreign Jews in France did. But timing must also be considered. 10.5% of Jewish deportees in the spring and summer of 1942 were born in France, but between the summer of 1943 and the summer of 1944, the number increases to 47% with French citizenship. The increase in deportations of French Jews coincides with the looting of the furniture operation and with the creation of a new administrative office within the prefecture dedicated to releasing so-called Jewish apartments to new tenants. This second half of the war is often overlooked in studies of anti-Jewish persecution, although it changes our perspective on exclusion, especially if we are looking from a housing perspective. In August 1942, the prefect of the Seine sent a letter to the finance minister with the first list of, quote, apartments that were sealed and sometimes emptied of their furnishings by the German authorities, the tenants of these apartments being presumed Israelites. At least 24 more lists would follow. Each included the name, address, the name of the tenant, the name of the property owner, the dates on which the apartment was sealed, the date on which it was emptied, and any observations. The 18th list of sealed apartments included 5 located in a building at 2 Square de Tocqueville, which was located on a short cul-de-sac in the Batignolles quarter of the 17th arrondissement. The apartments in this building were all owned by l'Industrielle Immobilière, a housing group, and were sealed in late March 1943 and subsequently emptied that summer and fall. Comparing these lists to the list of German requisitioned apartments created by the city's architectural supervisor suggests that some building owners provided the authorities with the name and address of available Jewish apartments rather than being identified first by the Germans. So again, it's kind of reversing what we might expect. Finding traces of these residents in the archives on more than lists can be challenging. From the restitution dossier, we learned that Monsieur and Madame Spitzer lived on the ground floor of 2 Square de Tocqueville. Their 1-bedroom apartment, where Monsieur Spitzer also had his law office, was looted in July of 1943. Henri Alexandre lived on the 4th floor with his wife, Hélène, and their teenage daughter, Nicole. All 3 were French citizens, but Henri was deported on September 21st, 1942, from the camp at Pithiviers to Auschwitz on Convoy 35, which was the last of 6 to leave directly from that camp. The circumstances surrounding Henri's arrest are unclear, and it appears that his wife and daughter then fled Paris sometime during the 1942-1943 academic year, and were arrested in early 1943 for forgery and fraud related to their identity cards. They were interned at the transit camp in Drancy and deported to Auschwitz on Convoy 62 in November of 1943. So there are lots of different apartments that were all owned by L'Industriel Immobilière in this building, all sealed and then emptied in relatively the same amount of time. And we have similar examples of this happening to tenants across the 17th. And it suggests that proximity, personal knowledge of abandoned apartments, and professional housing organizations all played a role in identifying and imperiling Jews, both French and foreign. These patterns are obscured, however, if we look only at citywide or neighborhood levels. Changing scale and paying attention to the time period reveals the importance of housing and persecution. So to return to the beginning of my talk and to widen our perspective to the broader questions, I want to return to the ideas of the role of housing in the physical and social exclusion of Jews in Paris and the question of Jewish survival in France. It has been argued that a shift in French public opinion occurred from indifference before 1942 to shock at the brutality of the arrests and deportations that year. As a result, some assert, people were more willing to help Jews after 1942, and certainly that is true. However, my ongoing research also reveals the increased willingness of others, from the Paris bureaucracy to individuals, to participate in exclusion justified by housing needs, even after 1942. The looting and reallocation of apartments that took place after 1942 was predicated on removing Jews, both French and foreign, from their physical space in the city. While the space of persecution in Paris was perhaps more dispersed than in cities with clearly delimited ghettos, exclusion was socially embedded and physically anchored in the apartment buildings, streets, and neighborhoods of the city in ways that become visible when we change scale and look at change over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. That was very interesting and fascinating. I think we collect questions for the end, isn't it? That's okay. So I will keep my questions also for them. But interesting always to talk about the change in scale, and you made it very clear to me, at least very clear, that changing the scale from this huge city of Paris to neighborhoods and even blocks of apartments, how that can really help us to gain more insight in how the different anti-Jewish measures worked really. So thank you very much. So the next speaker is Jan Burzlaff. Jan Burzlaff is the William A. Ackman Fellow for Holocaust Studies at Harvard University, USA, and a former fellow of ENS Paris. He is currently completing his dissertation, the first one transnational history of Jewish survival during the Holocaust, both Western and Eastern Europe. Further areas of interest are interdisciplinary approaches with the social sciences, comparative genocide, and global histories of violence. His latest articles on the Netherlands has just appeared in Contemporary European History. His paper today is entitled The Story of the Modas, Surviving the Holocaust, Brussels-Marseille-Grasse, 1940-1945. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Geraldien. It's great to be here and to see so many friends and colleagues. Thank you, as always, to Daniela, Boaz, Adi, and the team, Yaron, and thank you to all of you for attending. I would like, in the next 20 minutes or so, to solve or to try to solve a little puzzle that I came across during my research, and I will try to share my screen. Everybody can see it. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Okay. So the Modas story is that puzzle, what I call the Modas story. It is a story, a manuscript couched on 14 tightly typed pages in the Wiener Holocaust Library in London, Written down in November 57, in German it reads, "Our underground life in France during the war." The story stood out to me immediately, not only because of this elderly German couple's really incredible experiences. Unlike survivors who gave testimony after the late 1970s, I think of the Fortunov Archive, the USG Shoah Foundation, we know almost nothing about them. They are childless in their late 60s and wealthy. They ran a factory in Brussels. Mrs. Modas suffers from diabetes. Both are religious. That is all we know. What we do know, however, is how they survived in Vichy, France. With all of you today, as a result, I'd like to probe the following argument. Lacking the most basic information on the persecuted and persecuted Jewish individuals and communities is a challenge, but not a fatality. To understand the Holocaust in Western Europe, we must look at not only at top-down Nazi policies and national developments, but on the encounters on the ground. In the next 20 minutes or so, I will argue that these social encounters allow us not only to better understand Jews' responses to the persecution, but also the very social fabrics in which these encounters were embedded. Their story is indeed relentless, and you will see it right away as they were hunted from place to place. When the war broke out in May 1940, the Modas lived in Brussels as immigrants from Nazi Germany. They had arrived in the mid-30s. They set out to cross the French border by car, joining 8 million who fled south. They ended up in the city of Vichy, where they heard that all stateless Jews were soon to be interned. They decided to flee further south to Lourdes, a major Catholic pilgrimage site near the Spanish border. But at a hotel, they were denounced. Mrs. Moda was taken to Gurs, a camp run by the French state, Mr. Moda to an internment site near Bordeaux. At Gurs, she repeatedly fell into comas. They did not have any insulin, so she was freed after 3 weeks. When both were released, they decided to cross the Spanish border by car, again unsuccessfully. They moved to Perpignan, where they lived for 9 months in comparative peace. Arrested once more in 1941, they were sent for enforced residency to Prades, a small village in the mountains. The enforced residency was a tactic of the French state to keep watch of non-French Jews. All along, they tried to immigrate to the US. They never obtained a written permit to go to Marseille for a visa interview, yet they still went. After only 2 days in the city in Marseille, Mr. Moda fell seriously ill and spent the next 5 months in a hospital under false identity. He recovered, and the couple went to Grasse in Provence, where they rented a hotel room for another 9 months. Then came the summer of 1942, which we have already heard about with Shannon, with the roundups and hunt for Jews in the free zone in the south. They moved back to the hospital for 2 weeks, and Mr. Moda paid a doctor to simulate high fever, so he was declared unfit to be deported. Then things calmed down again, until they were ordered a few weeks later to the police in Nice. As no other plan succeeded, they moved back for 6 weeks into the hospital in Grasse, again under false names. Grasse was located in the Italian zone after 1942, which meant that the Italians registered the Jews, but the French police carried out the deportations. The Modas decided to leave for Nice because they felt safer in a larger city. But there they witnessed brutal arrests. Everybody was crammed into trucks. They immediately fled back to Grasse, a much smaller city. There they lived under false papers from fall 1942 to the liberation in August 1944. A perfume producer whom they had spontaneously encountered declined to hide them himself, but contacted 2 British women who owned a large estate. They accepted to take them in. On the estate, they even lived with German soldiers after D-Day in June 1944. Although they pretended to know not a single word of German, they passed on valuable information to the resistance and were liberated finally by Canadian soldiers on August 24, 1944. If you had to take a breath during their story, you're not alone. Their story is literally breathtaking, with relentless mobility, critical moments, and several arrests. How can we make sense of their experiences? Certainly the specificity of the Nazi occupation of France plays a role with the different zones, the French and the Italian one, which you see here in the south. Timing was also important. 1942 was the critical year to be arrested for non-French Jews. But existing historiography does not really help us shed light or shed further light, I would argue, on the Modas story. And there are two reasons for that, two primary reasons. For most people in France, and this has translated indeed after the late 80s into existing scholarship, a survivor still refers to somebody who survived the camps in Eastern Europe, who was deported. Here, this manuscript is a blessing indeed, as it was written before most of the state memory politics that took really shape, and I would argue started with President Chirac's speech in 1995. For these specific memory politics, I would refer you to the excellent book of Philip Noor, After the Deportation. Here, the accounts at the Wiener Library are among the earliest accounts of Western Europe, inviting fresh layers of Jewish experiences. And I would here, of course, shout out to our friend of the program, Christine Schmidt, who helped make these accounts available online. So thank you for that. Second reason, existing scholarship has often been top down in the legacy of Robert Paxton, Michael Maris, that some of you or many of you may know. But we need to find other reasons to understand those 75% of around 225,000 Jews who, like the Modas, were not deported. As Jacques Simlin, whom you can see on the right, and others have encouraged us, it is time to study how so many Jews survived in France, despite the Nazis and despite Vichy. Roughly 90% of French Jews and 60% of foreign Jews, as Shannon has already shown us. But there's still a reluctance in some corners of French academia, at least as well, to engage with Jewish testimonies, still considered somewhat untrustworthy. And all this has led to, I would say, quite a blind spot until the last few years, all the more when it comes to German Jews in France, because the Moda manuscript, after all, is in German, which is an additional language barrier. Now, there are several solutions to integrate these Jewish perspectives. Housing and space, as Shannon has just suggested. I would today, in my talk, offer the topic of social dynamics and social relations. It is indeed at the level, I think, on the interpersonal dynamics that we can see some of the dynamics of persecution and the Holocaust in Western Europe. As you saw with the map, I mapped not only the various movements they made in southern France, but all the encounters, and you can see this with blue and red. They had pre-war friends in Vichy, tells us Mrs. Moda, but they failed to meet them. They were on their own, unlike French Jews who could often rely on pre-war ties. This story indeed allows us to refine and to revise the case for social reactivity that Jacques Simlin suggested in 2013. Simlin defined social reactivity as the assistance that, quote, individuals without necessarily knowing each other and without prior instructions spontaneously provide to other individuals, whom most often they do not know. This could mean to say to somebody, do not go home, or don't turn right next, or just keep silent. Social reactivity, even 30 seconds of looking the other way, is also different from rescue, which becomes only rescue when the danger is effectively over. These acts of temporary support and spontaneous help surface in the Moda story, and we can follow them on the map. On their flight south, two men, most certainly future government employees, overheard them speak German and warned them. The Modas heeded their advice to flee as fast as possible. Shortly afterwards, when Mrs. Moda was injured in the Gurs camp, a French police officer presented her to the chief physician, pleading on the honor of France, as did a lung specialist in Marseille. At the police station in Grasse, the police officer whispered, "What can I do for you?" Because of Mr. Moda's illnesses, doctors and nurses dominate in the testimony, of course. But these moments, one can really see it, cut across gender and social lines. Take Grasse as an example, the world's, what's sometimes known as the world's capital of perfume. Here, a kitchen maid and an elderly impoverished lady, their hotel owner and a perfume business owner. The kitchen maid, moved by the couple, threatened the physician at the police. She would reveal, quote, a dirty little secret if he kept refusing to treat Mr. Moda. The elderly lady offered a basement for a hideout in August 1942. The owner of the hotel, where they stayed for 9 months, not only refused to check their papers, he also gave them the keys for his house in the mountains north of the city, allowing them to avoid deportation. Then a perfume business owner connected them to the resistance. All share one crucial fact. They did not know the Modas. Threats to ruin someone's reputation, national pride, French honor, anti-German sentiments, all these factors were present. These motivated these encounters, I would say. The real difference between them even most fittingly, is what one could call the knowledge gap. Most suspected that the Modas were Jewish refugees, some did not. And the money line. With a gold watch or other types of brides, you cross into a different area. The Modas experienced all this as well, but arguably less so than spontaneous gestures of help. In his book, Semlin attempted to explain Jewish survival in France by generalizing from certain individual stories. And I've had long discussions with our dear colleague Shannon, who recently suggested to anchor this idea of social activity in a specific time and place. So I wanted to take up this challenge. First, by playing with the scales, the geographical scales. And first, big data allows for the broader picture. If we look at all those who survived in Marseille and gave testimony to the US Shoah Foundation in the 90s, where did they go into hiding? Like the Modas, most started out in the Pyrenees Mountains in the south, towards the coastline, then to Montpellier, then Marseille, shifting towards the Italian zone, over time towards Nice, like the Modas. This quantitative analysis reveals certain patterns of hiding and help and encounters, which we need to explain, and I would concur with most recent scholarship that we have to do this at the local level. Many of the couples encounters indeed happened in Grasse. To explain them, we should combine the pre-war period and the wartime events in this really microcosm. The city had consistently voted for moderate left-wing politics before the war. The Radical Party, despite its name, was the first nationwide modern mass party in France. In the wake of the Front Populaire, which was a left-wing government elected in 1936, the Grasse district even elected a Jewish representative, Edouard Jonas, whom you can see on the right. From 1938, like other French cities, Grasse witnessed a period of disbelief and radicalization of a certain fraction of the population, not the least agitated by the newspaper, the Provence Progress, which was the authoritarian local newspaper. Once the Vichy regime in place, the center-left government under Mayor Carémil was replaced in March 1941 by a loyalist business owner, Henri Bernard. Like elsewhere, Grasse population seems to have accepted Pétain, the leader of the Vichy France. According to the city archive, around 10%, 2,200 people, joined the French Legion of Combatants, a core institution of the collaborationist regime. For Grasse, this raises the question, however, what about the remaining 70 to 80 to 90%? In fact, Semlin's concept can be fruitfully revised to include the opposite of spontaneous help, acts of exclusion and persecution. Because we should not romanticize these moments of social reactivity. But I believe it is up to, we can stretch it to capture the most diverse reactors of Christians and non-Jews in France and in Western Europe, indeed. The Modas experienced negative social reactivity too. They were denounced in Lourdes, some police officers in Grasse, certainly some of them members of the Légion, an anti-Semitic assistant physician, and a man in a pajama ready to run to the police in Nice. To quit a catch-all positive or negative assessment of French society, or for that matter, Belgian or Dutch society, I argue that we should rather look at behaviors that furthered or instead slowed down, if not prevented, German policies from the bottom up and also rooted in the interwar period. The center-left stronghold had experienced a refugee crisis. 1,200 men had been housed in Grasse during the Spanish Civil War, so the city was already accustomed to a refugee crisis. And I believe it is not a coincidence that the Modas sought shelter in the city chosen by non-local painters, such as Henri Matisse, Marc Chagall, and writers such as Paul Valéry during the war. Historian Jean-Louis Panicacci, classics book of the local region, makes clear that Grasse department was hit by food shortages, the invasion of the Nazis, which left a really strong impression, and the military battles after the summer of 1944. Grasse here appears as the average French city. Collaboration, Gaullism, armed organized resistance, everything was present. But those places, and that is an ongoing inquiry of mine at the moment, that Jews saw in southern France seem to have been predominantly center-left before the war. This is something intriguing, and I would like to study this more in the next few weeks and months. In any case, the sympathetic and detrimental behaviors must be situated within this longer perspective of the interwar period. French historians have often treated the wartime years as a blackout, and quite literally, they call it the dark years, les années noires. And instead, I think social reactivity does not mean that everybody hated or liked Jews, but gestures of support were rather often against the Nazis rather than for the Jews. As we have seen with Shannon, acts of personal gain, extorting someone persecuted, denouncing somebody to obtain valuables or an apartment or taking over an apartment could contribute to the persecution. In many cases did. But social reactivity also captures the opposite, I believe. As long as you can provide refugees with food, housing, there was no immediate advantage to denounce them. Above all, these behaviors do not necessarily contradict the overall approval of Vichy policies before 1942 at the very least, such as the faith in the leader Pétain. If we look at the excellent atlas of World War II France for the Department of Grasse, which is Alpes-Maritimes, there was a particularly strong presence of streets named after him, which you can see on the left, and local holidays in the honor of the Marshal on the left. But in the last 2 decades, scholars have demonstrated how much attitudes followed day-to-day needs and moods, and anti-Semitism often had a pragmatic rather than racial or ideological bent. Ultimately, few people gave blanket approval to Vichy. The Modas story, I believe, makes clear that scholars of Vichy France and the Holocaust should be more open to the inconsistency and changes over time. The tools we have to describe such relations, think of resistance, rescue, persecution, the righteous of the nations, are quite static and insufficient, I believe, to capture the encounters on the ground. Do you remember the perfume owner who declined to take the Modas in, but connected them with the British women? I found that he was, in fact, the center-left mayor before the war. How come he understands such behavior? He was not a rescuer, certainly, but he was also not an anti-Semite. Like this man, many more people engaged in small, even most fleeting behaviors of pro-Jewish stance than rather against anti-German sentiments, even most fleeting. And many more, I believe, engage in this very small period of help or support or even a smile, then they collaborated with the Nazis, joined the French resistance, or rescued Jews. And local archives indeed account for this shift of attitudes in Grasse from June 1940 to June 41. As similar, I disagree with Maris and Paxton's idea of this virulent French anti-Semitism, especially in the countryside, and René Ponzlansky's argument of Jews' social isolation. To be sure, isolation there was in distress that comes across in the testimony when they were about to be denounced again, or when Mr. Moda played mad in the hotel when militiamen wanted to arrest him. But their case and hundreds of others that I studied cannot really speak to a sense of social isolation, often quite the opposite. I just finished examining a testimony from Valence in the south. Postman opened mail intended for the Gestapo there, and they gave the list of people about to be arrested for to a doctor who could curtail the curfew and thus move around at night. And he warned everybody to flee before escaping himself. The case of the so-called helpers, those who helped shut down British pilots, also strong around Grasse, and the display, I would say, most fleetingly of patriarch symbols, which you can see on the right, as a way of protesting against Vichy, which could be wearing something related to the French Revolution or to the Third Republic, should also belong to a new cultural history of the Holocaust in Western Europe. And it's at the local level, to conclude, that we should start. In the case of the Modas, Grasse reveals the grassroots tensions of the city under Italian occupation, shaped by Vichy policies and German pressures. Like the Netherlands, about which I recently published an article, and quite unlike northern occupied France, social reactivity seems to have grown in a rather linear fashion in Grasse between 1940 and 42, not the least because of its pre-war experiences with refugees, Republican traditions, and social tensions on the ground in the city. Think of the kitchen maid extorting the chief police. Let us conclude. The Modas story is exceptional for its extreme mobility, the density of encounters, the role of luck, the speed at which choices had to be made, all these factors that I cannot go into now, which also includes staying in the Italian zone and the financial resources to do so. Timing was also of essence, as we saw. Almost 90% of all Jews deported in until the fall of 1942 did not have French citizenship, just like the Modas. Their short testimony invites us to use, I believe, social reactivity to write the history of Vichy France. The Modas could not rely on any long-lasting pre-war ties to survive, and yet these spontaneous encounters helped them in numerous ways. And social reactivity in both its detrimental and supportive sense help write a more complex, less binary history of wartime behaviors and choices. I would say more fine-grained social and cultural history of Western Europe. This must necessarily be a multipolar perspective, shifting from how the French people, how the Dutch people, how the Belgian people encountered the occupying regime. You can see on the left a classic book by Jean-Pierre Azéma and François de Derrida, classically described the encounters of the French population and the state. So you have a dual. Two, I would say, an ever-shifting triangle at the least. The modas and the choices, the full spectrum of encounters and social strata, and state authorities, Italian, French, and Nazi. The Mona testimony leaves us with many questions and a sobering admission that we will never really fully know more about them. Having spent time with them in the last few weeks to prepare this talk, I often wonder what they felt, how they spent their days, what the persecution did to them. But microhistory and a more systematic quantitative analysis brings us as close as possible to their experiences. After all, we are also what we did and whom we encountered. Many thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Jan. That was also a very inspiring talk. I find it very difficult not to ask questions. But I just want to briefly because I observed a few kinds of similarities and differences between your talk and Shannon's talk, and then we move to the talk of Professor Bob Moore. But just let me briefly say that what I find interesting, we're talking about new perspectives. So you both introduce a new perspective, I think, on the Holocaust in Western Europe. And what is more, you also both use very different sources, just a different kind of sources and methods of research, which is really, I think sometimes it's really overlooked if we look at, we do tend to look more to Eastern Europe, and Eastern Europe publications, studies coming from Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe there's at least a new small school of scholars working in this field with different sources, different methods. Also, what I said, I think in the beginning is you both play with scale and space and a difference of scales. So whether it's a neighborhood or an arrondissement or it's a couple, that I think is also very interesting. And one last thing that I would like to mention, what is striking me or what I observed in both of your talks, is the importance or the importance, I think, of differentiating in time. So I think in the talk of Shannon, it was very clear that there are key moments in the story of the Holocaust in France, at least, and also including the pre-war period and the after-war period. It's a longer trajectory in time, I think. Okay, I have much more things that are bubbling in my mind, but I keep it here. Yeah, we go to the last speaker. Let me introduce Bob Moore. Bob Moore is Professor Emeritus of the 20th Century European History at the University of Sheffield in the UK. He has published numerous works on 20th century European history, beginning with the study of the Nazi persecution of the Jews in the Netherlands in 1979, and more recently on refugee policies, prisoners of war during the Second World War, and comparative perspectives about Western Europe. I think there's also Jewish Self-Help and Rescue, a book, an international comparison of Western Europe. He has also edited the diary of Arnold Douwes, about which he will speak today. His talk today is entitled Everyday Rescue, the Heroes and the Hidden in the Diary of Arnold Douwes. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. Can I start by trying to share my screen with you? That doesn't help very much. Let's try that. Are we there? We're getting there. And it's not going too well. Can you see that? Yes?
Yes, we can see. Yes.
Okay, that's fine. We'll see if it works. What I can't seem to do is to move that out of the way. No, okay. Not helping matters. Okay.
You want to stop share and try again?
No, it's a function of the controls on this, but we'll try.
We can see it.
Yeah, okay. We'll leave it there and see if it works. That's fine. Okay. My apologies for the slight technical hitch. That's not helping either. Okay. Let me begin by thanking you for the invitation to talk to you this evening and to talk about Arnold Douwes, who I encountered many years ago in my initial researches on the persecution of the Jews in the Netherlands. And I know that many people who are listening in this evening have as much, if not more, knowledge about his career than I have. He's an important individual in our understanding of what happens in Holland. He's a remarkable individual in many respects, primarily, and I'll see if we can flick that over, that's better. Primarily because of the nature of what he does, his own history, and the fact that he probably uniquely, and one might say rather stupidly, kept an embryonic diary of his activities during the period of occupation. As I say at the bottom of this screen, he writes down every few days what he's been doing, who's he encountered, his thoughts about what he's doing, places them in notes, puts them in jam jars, and then buries them in various gardens. Now, perhaps it's a fairly unusual thing to do, and we could question why he was going to do this in the first place. But because he survives the occupation, he's able to revisit the jam jars, dig them up, and then in the following 2 years, partly by virtue of prompts from the Dutch government and the embryonic, as it was then, Rijksinstituut voor Oorlogsdocumentatie, the Institute for War Documentation, to write down these experiences in more linear form. And what we have therefore is a manuscript, perhaps a unique manuscript, of somebody running a rescue network that involved certainly hiding over 200 people, and many sort of people alongside him. And the idea was that we have this record of his contemporary thoughts, largely untrammeled by what happened afterwards. And that's important. That it's interesting that when he, somewhat later in life in the 1970s, wanted to think about publishing his diary in English, which he never got around to doing, he started annotating the original version. And as a result of that, you see other thoughts and indeed some contradictions creeping into his narrative. I've described him as both an outsider and an insider. An outsider in the sense he was very much a black sheep of a family of, his father was a clergyman, some of his siblings also became clergymen. So he's brought up in a bourgeois environment, a learned environment, in a part of the Netherlands, in the Eastern Netherlands. I'll talk about that in a second. But he's the outcast. He's the one who doesn't go into what you might call a lettered career. He takes up horticulture. He fails his horticultural examinations. In 1926, he goes to the United States and spends 10 years bumming around the United States. You know, as he himself claims, eating out of trash cans, you know, acting the hobo lifestyle, doing all sorts of stuff, until by his own lights, I've never been able to authenticate this, he gets deported from the United States in 1936, comes back to the Netherlands briefly, finishes his studies, but when war breaks out in 1939, he's actually working as a gardener in southern France. Coming back to the Netherlands in 1940, he commits various anti-German acts in those early months. So by 1941-42, he's already on the run and pitches up back in this small village in Nieuwlanden in Drenthe, and attaches himself to the local resistance run by a man, you know, a very important figure called Johannes Post. And when Perspe goes on to bigger and better things, but also has to himself to go underground, Douwes takes over the rescue side of Perspe network and stays in charge of this until 1944. And the diary reflects what he does in that period. Let's see if I can get this to turn over. No, I can't. Oh, yes, I can. There we are. These are shameless plugs for the diary that Geraldien has already mentioned. I raise them here only because for my Israeli friends and colleagues here tonight, there is a Hebrew version being plotted by Yad Vashem. I'm not sure when it will come out, but it's in the pipeline. Let me move on quickly. Douwes operates in this eastern province of Drenthe. It's a small agricultural, very overwhelmingly agricultural, very poor province in the eastern Netherlands. It's overwhelmingly Protestant. Very few Roman Catholics there, if any at all. Split between the Dutch Reformed Church and the Orthodox Calvinists, where the Orthodox Calvinists tend to be the bourgeois elements within these societies, and the Dutch Reformed Church more the working classes, if you like. Its other major issue is that it's, or had in the 1930s, a higher than average level of support for Dutch National Socialism. In part, this is probably not Nazism per se, but produced more by the local politics of the farmers there. But Nieuwlanden itself is a very small community. It's cut off from the rest of, even from its locality. Just a few postcards of the elements here. And one small story of the church there, the Calvinist church in Nieuwlanden. When we held the book launch for the Dutch edition of the diary, we asked the then custodians of that church whether we could use it for the book launch. And we were told very firmly this wasn't possible because churches weren't to be used for any sort of frivolous purpose. But anyway, we'll move on swiftly from that. What I want to talk about for the next few minutes is the things that I found unusual in reading through the diary and ultimately in translating it. Some of these things will be familiar to many people here this evening, but these were things that struck me as being not what I expected from a rescue network. The title Everyday Rescue is shamelessly stolen from Richard Bosworth's work on Italian fascism, but it gives a sense of the micro history, the everyday, right the way down to the social relations. Jan's already talked a lot about that, but I'm going to say a little bit just at the end if I can. But I want to just talk vaguely on these 6 headings, just to give you a sense of the sort of things that struck me as I was working through this text. First of all, building his network, he inherits this network, but then looks to build it because he's constantly looking for new addresses, new places where he can hide people. This is not only for new arrivals, but also for people who have to be moved for one reason or another. It's very consciously the case that in order to get around from one village to another, one place to another, and he does this a great deal, you can almost plot his movements from week to week, and he must travel hundreds of kilometers some weeks on bicycle journeys from one way. And this is his major mode of transport. Bicycles, not on main roads because they're subject to controls and German patrols, but through pathways, byways, and so on and so forth. It's also very noticeable that he often uses local churchmen, both for advice about who to approach and also sometimes as intermediaries. And he uses both the Dutch Reformed Church and the Orthodox Calvinist Church for this purpose. And a friend of mine who has worked extensively on this pointed out, he said, well, the divisions between these two churches aren't quite as stark, even theologically, as some people have led us to believe. So there's this fair amount of interchange going on here. But his point is that by going to the local pastor, he's not likely to be betrayed. He may not get a lot of help, but he's not going to get shot to the local Germans, and that's important. Even where he gets cooperation, and sometimes the pastors will send somebody round with him to approach locals who they think might be sympathetic to what he's trying to get them to do. Usually not the pastors themselves, but their underlings on the bus stories, call them what you like, so that the church can sort of keep a distance from what's going on. In the diary, it's clear that Douwes, by his own admission, is not the best person at persuading people. He loses his temper all the time. And so he often has to be mediated out. But as I say, he's under constant pressure to find new addresses. His network gets bigger and bigger as time goes on. He has to move further and further off from the centre in Newland to other municipalities, other places. Now, his success is in making sure that there are enough places to hide all these people, but it is complicated. It does present enormous problems. And as the scale of the operation gets bigger and bigger, it becomes increasingly insecure, to the point whereby in October 1944, when he is finally, or just before he's arrested, he's in his own hiding place, refusing to talk to any of the people that he's working with because he can no longer do anything. The network's almost imploding at the point where, you know, he himself is under threat. Another thing which is remarkable in this context is the fact that we tend to talk in binary terms about non-Jewish rescuers and Jews who are helped. But in this particular network, this doesn't happen. There are a number of Jews who are absolutely essential to the working of this network. Max Leons, who I had the delight of meeting at the launch of the Dutch Diary, who was then 97 years old, but still with us and still very active, who was not only, technically he was in hiding, but he actually went round with Douwes doing all sorts, he became his sort of right-hand man for the best part of 18 months, at least a year, before he himself had to go finally underground. Now, Leons was hampered in a sense because he had a very Jewish appearance, but was able to survive by all sorts of tricks in order to stay above ground, as it were, to aid the work practically. There are two others here too. He's David, who's a graphic designer, who becomes the forger for the network, forging ration cards or adapting identity cards, and these are essential parts of keeping the network going. And Lou Gunst, who's an artist who turns his hand to producing news sheets and also later on to manufacturing postcards, which were then sold to benefit the network. Finding the money. This was something that also struck me as, or perhaps I hadn't considered it enough, that these networks required vast amounts of money. Now, in some cases, if we look at other comparisons here, if we look at the activities, for example, of the Comité de Défense des Juifs in Belgium, they fairly rapidly have access to large amounts of funds through the Belgian banking system. Now, that also becomes the case in the Netherlands through the Nationale Steunfonds, but only really in 1944. So this network is largely operating independently of any outside help. It has to raise its own money for most of the people it's helping. Some people have their own resources and can afford to pay monthly for their upkeep, but most can't. And one of Douwes' first jobs is to go around and raise the money for his own network, something he hates doing. Not least because he goes around and people say, yeah, here's 10 guilds or 15 guilds, now go away, don't ask me to do anything else. But one of the things that comes out of this, and one of the things that you see in the diary, is the fact that when one starts to look, he records what he's paying to house these individuals. And because the network understands what's going on, it can more or less control the amounts of money that are being demanded. So there's sort of going rate for housing people. That might vary a little bit if the people themselves are also providing work services for their hosts. But there's all sorts of detail there that one can find, you know, in the context of the diary. And it's quite an interesting exercise to plot that through. Finding food. Even in agricultural areas like Drenthe, Food distribution was essentially controlled by ration cards, which was in turn controlled by identity cards. Now, you couldn't take an identity card, which in the Netherlands for Jews were all stamped with the letter J. So one needed an alternative method of obtaining ration cards. That either came through forged or altered identity cards, which were sometimes stolen or bought in some cases. Latterly, with the existence of a local armed resistance, this local network was in a position to benefit from raids on distribution centres, municipal offices, which could steal large numbers of blank cards, which could then be filled in, and only the stamps on them had to be forged. And you can see all of this being part and parcel of this process. I talked about East Davids. He's almost fully employed forging, cards and documents of various types in order to make this possible. But this is essential for finding food. But then you look at the way in which the hosts have to go about buying the food. Even if they've got the money to buy it and the ration cards, they can't buy all the food in one place, because it gives away the fact they're buying far more food than for the number of people they're supposedly in their family. So they have to go around, they themselves have to move around in order to buy food in different places to stop from drawing attention to themselves. The meaning of hiding, and this again comes across very clearly in the example that I'm quoting. Apart from Max Léonce, it's an archetypal example of somebody who's hiding in plain sight. But many of the other people who are helped by this network are also able to work on farms or as domestic help, because nobody will ever see them. These are isolated communities. So the idea that in hiding means permanently ensconced in an attic, a la Anne Frank, or hiding in a cellar, and there are plenty of examples of that too, doesn't really fit this particular model or this particular picture of the network. Many of the refugees that exist do have hiding places. I've listed them: cupboards, cellars, lofts, haystacks, but they're only there for emergency purposes. Only if there was some immediate danger were they likely to be used. For the most part, the people being helped could lead, I won't say normal lives, but certainly quasi-open lives in this particular part of the Netherlands. Certainly in the case of Nieuwlanden, in spite of the known National Socialists, there seems to have been largely a conspiracy of silence. That's the title of, almost the title of a book published by the community after the war. But what I want to focus on here is not so much that, conscious of the time that I'm taking up, but to come back to Jan's point about the sociology of hiding. One of the things that struck me about this was we know very little in many cases about the day-to-day relations between hosts and the people they're hiding. And yet for Douwes, this is a day-to-day problem. The people in hiding are not necessarily passive recipients. They have their own views about what they should be doing, how they should be treated. They have their own ideas about what it means to be in hiding. And so he has numbers, and of course they feature more prominent in the diary, numbers of prominent cases who are problematic for all sorts of reasons, like the young Jewish girl who is living openly in a farm somewhere, but goes out dating German soldiers. And they constantly have to threaten her because this is leading potentially the whole network into problems. They had another woman who had all sorts of airs and graces, who just decided one day that she was going back to Amsterdam. And it was, Douwes condemns her and says, well, she can't treat us as a travel agent. She can't decide she doesn't. But she was moved at least 10 or 12 times in Nieuwlanden alone. And none of the places that she was put were sufficiently satisfactory for her. And you might imagine that some of the conditions in these localized farmhouses were very different from what the Amsterdam Jewish bourgeoisie were used to. I raise that as an issue because these are all sorts of things that could be divined from the diary and could, and perhaps should, be looked at in more detail in the future. last issue I'm just going to raise finally is the role of religion. Douwes does not of himself come across as a particularly religious man. But he does come from an active church background. He certainly hasn't rejected religion, or he's clearly, wandered off from the path a long way. And you do see his background coming back into his behavior. He quotes extensively from the Bible, both in the diary and also in his arguments with other people about how they should be helping and why, the ideas about Christian charity. He's encyclopedic about the Old Testament. And it only struck me later on when I was going through the diary in detail, he and Léonce don't do a great deal of activities on a Sunday. And it's not entirely, I don't know the answer to this. I don't know whether it's down to his own belief that one should not be active on a Sunday, or because his network of helpers wouldn't countenance him turning up on a Sunday, or possibly they just wouldn't be at home. They'd probably be in church themselves. But he raises all sorts of intriguing arguments about the nature of the motivations behind what he does, whether it's driven by religion or whether he's just using religion as a basis for extending the network. As you can tell from this, there's a whole load, many more things that one could talk about in this context. I've only picked on a very few here. I'm certainly not going to do any more work on this myself, but I think there's a lot more scope for the type of micro history to take this to another level in answering some of the questions that I've tried to raise this afternoon. But I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Bob. Again, another space or another scale, the very small scale of an individual man, but then again, you show a complete microcosm really of the Holocaust in the story of one single man. And I think your story also complicates and nuances the story of the Holocaust, or of hiding in particular, of course. First of all, what is hiding? It's always interesting to see, particularly in the Netherlands, that so many people, many Jews in hiding were actually not hiding. They were very visible, particularly children, of course. I find also very interesting the conspiracy of silence that you said, that this whole village actually in England is very aware of what is happening. And I was just wondering, but then I leave the floor to other questions. I was just wondering how your story relates to the story of Jan, more specifically the concept of social reactivity, because this is not a story of social reactivity. I think it's much more a story maybe of Midlarsky's idea of altruism or religiously motivated help. But that is just something. Maybe if there's time over, I would like.
I'm sure we can come back to that. But I one of the things that I didn't talk about, but in some respects undermines the sort of altruistic element, is the levels that Douwes has to go to persuade people to help. There's a classic story which I've reproduced, and I'm sure many other people know it too, where faced with somebody who had said they would help and then didn't, he turns up with a Jewish couple, and there's an argument on the doorstep, and it's 2 minutes before the curfew kicks in, and just at that point he more or less picks this couple up, throws them through the door and slams the door and runs away and leaves them to sort it out. And that it gives you an impression that it wasn't all straightforward. It wasn't, yes, there was a lot of altruism involved in it in places, but there was a lot more in terms of sort of material gain and indeed some coercion as well. Anyway, I'll leave that there.
Okay, I will also, because I think that Daniela, you are collecting the questions and will lead the discussion.
Yes, I'm collecting the questions. And then we can have a short discussion. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. It was fascinating to listen. I've taken a look at the chat. We do have some questions for some of our speakers. I'd like, with your permission, maybe to start with the first question. I have a first question to maybe even two to Shannon, and another question for the three of the speakers. Shannon, regarding your presentation, first of all, thank you very much. It was fascinating. I would love to hear more. Maybe you can shortly elaborate a bit more on you've referred to the new tenants, referring, of course, to French people who are entering the empty apartments, empty houses of deported Jews. I'd like to hear your opinion about those people and the question of anti-Semitism. How much have they inquired after the war, or even during the war, after the deportation of the original tenants of those apartments, who they were, where they are, how much were they occupied with this question? How much do you know about this? I'd like to know more if there's research done on that. Question number one. Number two, a little bit about more about the denunciators. If you, I mean, to know about a family living in an apartment, you'd have, of course, have to have someone who denunciates them. So maybe a little bit a description about, were there more women denunciating or men denunciating? I know from my own research concerning Germany, it was definitely more women denunciating Jews in Germany, in Berlin. And I wondered if this is, I mean, when we relate to other countries during the war, was it more men, more women? What were the motivation, social economic background, maybe on this? And a question for the three of the speakers, maybe a look towards the future. You were mentioning the fact that the Holocaust research has more focused on Eastern Europe, and since all of you are focusing more on the West, I'd like to know, each on your research field, what is yet to be studied? What would you say is not inquired enough and needs more focus, or more research, I would say research focus on your own fields? Thank you very much. I'll collect also what we have in the chat, and then we'll make a round, and then we'll wrap it up. And I have here two questions from Mark Wilson. One is for Shannon, and the other one I think is also for Jan. Question for Mark, for Shannon: how far would Professor Fogg take that conclusion regarding willingness of some in French society to be complicit in persecution to access housing? Does this start to draw closer comparison with Eastern European experiences and scholarship on willingness of bystanders and non-German perpetrators to assist persecution? And another question for Mark to Jan: what other factors have you considered alongside correlation of pre-war political characteristics of places and tendency for Jews in hiding to be concentrated in some of these places? How far does landscape factor in choice of hiding places too? I just want to see if there are any more questions. Okay, let's. I'll let you answer, and then maybe in between there are some more. Please.
Thank
Shannon,
you,
maybe
Adi.
we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. These are really great questions, and I think a lot of things that overlap, and maybe people can add to as well. In terms of the question of new tenants, and if people are doing research, I will point especially to the research of Sarah Jean-Berger, Isabelle Bacouche, and Eric Le Bohis, who are all working on, they are working specifically on the question of these new tenants and figuring out how people knew. And one of the things that they have found in their research is through this mapping. We've all been working kind of collaboratively, and I see Hilary Handens here as well, and she's done a study as well. And we just had a special issue of Histoire Urbaine that came out in December that focuses on housing in Paris. But in Sarah and Isabel and Eric's research, they found that by mapping, something like 10% of the people moving into a new apartment are moving into an apartment within their own building. And then the amount within like 400 meters is also very large. So it's that question of proximity and of seeing things knowing that your neighbor was there or not there anymore, walking by places on your way to work, perhaps. And this housing service actually created forms for people to fill out that said, where do you live now? Where would you like to live? And if you have a specific place in mind, and it actually said, if you have a specific Jewish apartment in mind, please inquire with the concierge and find out when that apartment was emptied. So there is very much knowledge that who these apartments belong to. And so I think some of it is proximity, but I've also seen a lot of letters where people are writing and they talk about people have left and they use the language of the time and they say, I want to rent this apartment to an Aryan or to a father of a French family. And so they're actually using the language and whether that's opportunistic or drawing on the things that are around them, or if that is part of that kind of virulent anti-Semitism that we see in some of the other scholarship, it's kind of hard to know. It's that question of material gain and what is likely to motivate someone to help you. I think the thing
material gain and the question of anti-Semitism, how do they correlate? Yeah,
exactly, and that's hard to untangle in ways. And thinking about, and the thing that I think is interesting in the housing is that there aren't laws that are put in place specifically to target Jewish homes. They're using the laws that are already there. And so the fact that an apartment is abandoned and someone has stopped paying rent is the reason why you can get these apartments. But it's kind of ignoring the reason why those apartments are empty. And others are not ignoring. They know exactly why those apartments are empty. So it's a very complicated question. I think so is the question of denunciations, because I think people would not see themselves as denouncing anyone, right? That there are often, when they're sending these letters, they have very specific reasons why they want those apartments. And it's usually after they're empty rather than before, or they know that the people are no longer there, but it hasn't been emptied yet. And so they're asking people to empty it so that they can then have access to it. But it's often something like, I've just gotten married and we're living in a very small apartment, and how can I raise a family for France if I don't have more space? And I know there's a 2-bedroom apartment upstairs. Could you please empty it so I can have it? So again, those things are kind of connected. But in terms of gender, I would say actually the majority of the letters that I have seen that are like that come from men. And I don't know if that's because men are the leaseholders usually, and they would be the ones kind of responsible for finding housing. But you also have the situation of millions of men who are prisoners of war. And so their wives looking for better housing for their families as well. So, but I don't know, I don't have a statistical kind of breakdown. And I'll pause there and I'll think about Mark's question and let other people jump in as well.
Okay, the question for the three of you regarding future scope. Maybe Jan, would you like to start?
Yes, happy to. Future areas of research. I think one is really one. I think two. Just on top of my head, I would give two. I think Jewish perspectives are really important to integrate, especially for France. Belgium has been really also examined top down very well in terms of the policies and national developments, but I think we need to reach some more comparative perspectives. And I think this could be really well done with the 3 countries, as Bob has already shown the way. But this also means playing by scales with micro community groups, cities, regions. I think that is really important. And that also means integrating the interwar period more than it has been done before. And this also, bridging the gap between, to come back to Hillary's question about the quantitative and qualitative, I think is really the fabric of the personal experience can only be brought by the really close study of ego documents. of all groups involved. But the quantitative adds something really important because we have these numbers. I also work on Eastern Europe, and there, of course, number statistics are much, much more difficult to establish just because of the dynamics of warfare. We have these statistics, and I think we can use them in the future much better, integrate them much better in the scholarship than we have done so far.
Lovely, thank you. Would you like maybe to answer Mark's question while we are?
Oh, absolutely. I look into various factors, and that is ongoing research at the moment. So it's really hot off the desk, so to speak, in terms of the role of religion. There's some great work on the Netherlands already, Catholic versus Protestant. So the factor of religion, language in Belgium, Flemish versus French, the presence of police force, NSB in the Netherlands, and the Légion, as I hope to show for Grasse, the role of geographical factors, of course, southern France with the mountains. And so there are various factors that can be included in such a study. So I will keep you updated on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Moore, maybe you would like to share with us some insights on what you find missing in the research right now and needs more scope.
Well, I think I'd reiterate and reinforce everything that's been said so far, because there is still plenty of work that could be done. I think in some respects we've lost an opportunity. I think that even 20 or 30 years ago, it might have been possible to do more historical sociology on these issues when people were still around and still conscious of what had happened to them. Of course, it would be problematic, but we've now lost that generation completely. We are relying now on written sources, to some extent on things like the Fortunov Archive and the Spielberg program, but there are enormous problems with that in some respects, which is why Douwes's diary was so unusual, because it is contemporaneous. And my initial thought was to say, okay, there must be other diaries like this. I'll go and do some sort of comparative exercise. And I looked and I looked and I looked, and there's nothing like it. Other people may know differently, but I certainly couldn't find anything on that sort of scale. And so it is a microcosm, but it does then allow us to ask a lot of questions. The other thing I would say about this was when Johannes ten Kate and I were trying to make sense of the background to the diary. There were all sorts of localized questions about the neighborhood and about the documentation and about day-to-day life that we couldn't find answers to. One that I referred to briefly was, what does it cost to, what do people pay as rent, normal rent for a month, to rent a room? There was no way of finding that out, because the local press, although it carried advertisements, this is wartime. People couldn't move around anyway. You couldn't get, objective figures of what norms might be. And we had also a question about ration cards. We couldn't answer either. It's that sort of micro history. You think it ought to be there. And then you find that it's not. It ought to be a straightforward, we can find that. Here's a footnote, bang, solved. And it doesn't work that way. And I'm sure, looking around the room, the virtual room here, I know many scholars who I can see who've also worked from the Netherlands and probably on other countries in Europe as well, would say exactly the same thing. There's loads of things we just don't know, either because they haven't been recorded or they've been lost over time, but are nonetheless integral to our understanding of these micro histories.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Shannon, maybe you'd like to? Sure, of course.
And kind of build on what Bob is saying as well. I think it's thinking about the sources that we use. We often go to things that might be labeled as Holocaust archives, or are specifically, right, the things that are coming specifically from the Nazis or for the government. But what kind of ordinary sources, like everyday, because the everyday things still keep happening. So, everyday records of buildings, or, how can we use those in different ways? Can we look at architectural plans and what does that tell us? If a building has more than one entrance or exit, does that make a difference? So looking at kind of those ordinary archives that are just part of regular records. And that this goes to what Jan is saying as well, that looking at that longer period, it's something, they're the same records, whether it's during the pre-war, wartime, or post-war periods as well. And I think one of the things that I think this panel does is really thinking about Western Europe as part of it, and including the voices. As Jan mentioned, survivors were often seen as only those who came back from one of the camps in the East, but what did it mean to be a survivor in France or in the Netherlands or in Belgium, and putting that as part of the story as well.
Thank you very much to all three speakers. And I'm very happy to give the stage to Dr. Boaz Cohen, head of the Holocaust Studies program of the Western Galilee College, for some concluding words. Please, Boaz.
Thank you very much. It was really a fascinating panel, and actually well needed. As Geraldine said in the beginning, we have not all is quiet on the Western Front. And I think now, especially when with the war in the Ukraine, we hear a lot about the Bloodlands. And I think the whole Bloodlands theory is problematic because the Holocaust is a global story. It's certainly a European story, encompassing Balkans and Greece and Western Europe. And people are being persecuted and then moved to be killed. But this is not a story. The story of the Holocaust is not about the Bloodlands. It happens in that area, but it's a global story and certainly a European story. This is what we saw today. Now, one thing we did see is that it's not only that it's one story, it's that the stories are connected, because the issues of people taking over apartments are all over Europe, wherever Jews are. And we were discussing today, I saw a researcher of Thessaloniki was writing about how did the German turn the Jewish gold and apartments into the funding of the occupation regime in Greece? I mean, the occupation regime in Greece was bankrupt, and the way to fill it, to use it, to save it, sorry, was to sell Jewish property, homes, gold, everything, and with this money to give breathing space to the occupation authority administration in Greece. So when we look on this issue of taking Jewish property and people interested specifically in certain property, and by the way, after the war, not really happy to give it back. This is something we see a lot in Western Europe, and we see it also in Eastern Europe. So I think this is a really important point, and we had really a good research. We saw microhistory, we saw geographical history, we saw use of big data, we saw context, we saw social issues. Actually, the people, we saw history from below. So that's, I think, a lot of historical trends and modern historical trends were present here. But I think, so first I want to say thank you, to wish you all Chag Sameach, a happy Passover, for I mean, we wish it happy for everyone, whatever his denomination is. And I see that Geraldine wrote that she has 3 ideas and wishes, and we will finish with the 3 wishes by Geraldine. The floor is yours, and when you finish, we will wrap up. Geraldine, please.
Sorry, I was typing and I pushed the send button, not on purpose, but I wanted to write it all down as a kind of a message to give. I had 3 ideas, and I will just briefly discuss it. I think on the social, in the area of social history, I think it would be, of course, interesting to know more about the relations between Jews and Gentiles, and particularly, of course, the non-Jewish locals. So how their motives, their attitudes and actions. So what are they doing, and how are they changing over time? I think in Western Europe, we don't know much about that still. And I think it's also interesting to look at more in detail in political history and look at the motivations or the motives also of political actors. I mean, we heard Shannon talking about the Parisian officials, and they really were proactively trying to re-rent or resell the apartments, and that's quite interesting. So why are they collaborating with Nazi policies, and what are their reasons behind it or motives behind it? Is it maybe instrumental that they are collaborating in anti-Jewish affairs sometimes? And the third thing, and I think many people also mentioned it in the chat, I think the history of hiding is really understudied, particularly in the Netherlands. Many things that Bob also raised, they're all new questions, they're all new alleys or avenues of research, or venues of research, I think, that could be very interesting. But I didn't mention, I didn't mean to, I just was writing it down. Thank you very much, Boaz.
Thank you, Geraldine. Thank you to all the speakers. Thank you for all of you who were with us until now. And see you in our next event. And we'll meet again.
Thank you to everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.